Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here with us today. I'm Andy Miller. I'm a professor here at UMBC in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems, and I coordinate our seminar series. And you will hear about our speaker in just a moment. Before we do that, I'm just going to mention a couple of things coming up. First of all, this coming Friday, 2 days from now, we have the UMBC Earth Day Symposium, which is going to be running all day. We will also have the US GES Water Science Center has an open house starting at 1:30 from about 1:30 to 2:30. And there's also a signing ceremony at 3:30 in the library gallery for the memorandum of understanding between UMBC and EPA and USGS, and a number of our faculty and students will be there making some brief remarks. We'll have the director of the EPA Chesapeake Bay program, President Valerie Shears Ashby, and folks from USGS who will be taking part in that ceremony. And then there's other things going on in the afternoon for Earth Day as well. Next Tuesday, we have a visitor from Portugal, Dr. Thomas Panagopoulos, speaking in the afternoon, I think at 4 p.m. on nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. An announcement will be coming out with details about that. That's going to be held in person on campus. And then a week from today, next Wednesday, Dr. Charles Ichoku, who's director of the Guest Star 2 Center and our newest professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems, is going to be presenting a seminar titled In Search of Lake Chad, Africa's Great Lake. Charles is here. Hello, Charles. So look forward to that. I'll be sending out a flyer about that later today. So thanks. I'm going to turn it over now to Anna Mothersall, who is a PhD student in the department working with Dr. Chris Swan, and she is going to introduce our speaker. Anna, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Dr. Lucy R. Hutyra is a professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. She received her PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences in 2007 from Harvard University. In 1998, she received her Bachelor of Science in Forest Ecology and Management from the University of Washington. Professor Hutyra's areas of specialization include urban climate and biogeochemistry, remote sensing, and vegetation ecology. She is a national leader on measuring and modeling urban greenhouse gas fluxes and advancing our understanding of carbon cycling in cities. Her current research centers on improving our understanding of the urban carbon cycle, particularly the role of vegetation and land use change on the flows of carbon between the biosphere and the atmosphere. Dr. Hutyra has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and chapters in edited volumes, including serving as a contributing author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, AR6 Working Group 3, Mitigation of Climate Change chapter on Urban and Systems and Other Settlements. She is the recipient of a National Science Foundation Career Award, a National Academy of Science Kavli Fellow, and currently serves on the NASA Earth Science Federal Advisory Committee. Hutyra also serves as the director of the Boston University Biogeosciences Program and the Associate Director for the Boston University Urban Interdisciplinary Doctoral Program.
Great. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be with all of you today virtually. And it's always hard to give these talks virtually, so hopefully everyone will stay awake and engaged. I'll try to walk you through a story of what my group has been doing for the last several years in thinking about the impacts of urbanization and forest fragmentation, which often go hand in hand, on the cycling of carbon dioxide. So I love this picture. This is Boston, and you can see the skyline of Boston, and you could also see a tremendous amount of vegetation that is present right in the inner core. And a lot of our thinking yesterday, today, about cities and vegetation assume that there is none, and that it's really dominated by these heat islands and impervious surfaces. But I think what I'll walk through today will hopefully convince you it's more nuanced, and those trees that we see in this image are actually doing much more than what we would have assumed. So this is the compulsory introductory slide for any talk about the carbon cycle, and I'm sure you've all seen it. I'll put a twist on it in a moment, but atmospheric CO2 has been rising for a long time. It's been rising at not quite a steady rate, where the amount of CO2 that is remaining in the atmosphere is not constant year to year, but there's a strong seasonal cycle in atmospheric CO2, and this is the leading cause of global climate change today. So we've seen figures like this for a long time. What you maybe haven't, so the controls on the CO2 in the atmosphere are many. This is a figure that I actually quite like from the Global Carbon Project. This one is a couple of years old. I should pull a new one. But it shows some of the big perturbations that are driving that increase in atmospheric CO2. And so this is a multi-year average, the numbers that you're seeing here. And in my talk today, I will focus on a few of these. Most of my attention will be on the biosphere, which is a net sink of 13 gigatons of CO2 per year on average. I'll also talk about land use change, which in aggregate is assumed to be about 6 gigatons of CO2 per year source, contributing to the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And then I'll also talk about direct observations of CO2 in the urban atmosphere and the contribution of fossil fuel emissions in cities specifically. So I'll hit a number of the key global fluxes and drivers of those CO2, that CO2 concentration that we see. So if I start with fossil fuels, this is another Global Carbon Project graphic that just shows the increasing amount of global fossil fuel emissions. You can see an uncertainty band around this that doesn't look that huge from this perspective. It's something like a 5% uncertainty, and it's been a pretty smooth rate of increase with some recent stabilization. And you see some of the perturbations like COVID or the global financial crisis, but really this has been a pretty slowly shifting curve. And a lot of our thinking about CO2 is based on graphics like this. But if we want to focus on cities, it's actually much more heterogeneous and dynamic than this. This is a figure from one of the inventories that we've worked to develop. My group has been for a number of years developing high resolution hourly fossil fuel emissions inventories. This one is just for the United States, and you can see that there's actually a lot of spatial pattern in where and when the CO2 emissions are occurring. And this is really important because about 70% of the fossil fuel emissions globally are occurring in cities. So cities occupy something on order of 3% of global land, but 70% of global CO2 emissions are concentrated on that 3% of land. So if we're thinking about climate mitigation, if we're thinking about assessing if our goals are actually being actualized in the atmosphere, cities are a really important place to look. And we need spatially resolved emissions estimates to be able to do that. So this is a local version of the Keeling curve. What's shown here, you see the same annual cycle like what you saw in that first introductory slide. But in this top panel is carbon dioxide. In the second panel is methane. And these are measurements that these black points here are from the building that I'm sitting in right now at Boston University. And you can see that there isn't one CO2 number. The number here in my building, which is just outside of downtown, is a little bit different than the one right in the center of downtown in Copley Square. And the blue points here are in Canaan, New Hampshire at a completely forested site about 100 kilometers away. And the red points are at the Harvard Forest LTER site about 100 kilometers away. What's shown here is just afternoon measurements when the atmosphere is well mixed. And what you can see is the same kind of broad pattern like what you saw in that initial cycle, but an enhancement. There's about 10-ish parts per million difference in the CO2 concentration that you see in the city versus out of the city. Methane is slightly different, but the same broad phenomenon of an urban enhancement in the methane concentrations. And both of these make sense because cities in these urban areas, like I showed you with that last pretty map, are where most of the fossil fuel is combusted. those 70% of emissions, you could see actualized in the spatial gradient and what the concentration looks like. And this is pretty cool, actually, because CO2 is a well-mixed pollutant, it's a well-mixed gas. And even with a well-mixed gas, to see a gradient of 10 parts per million is a lot. So we've been making these measurements since 2012, and we published this paper a couple of years ago, and this paper has been haunting me for a long time since to try to understand it. Let me walk you through this really briefly. This is showing about a year and a half of data. So you have time on the x-axis, and again, we're showing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. In the gray is the boundary condition. So this is air from either New Hampshire or Harvard Forest. This is clean air in these rural forested areas that is inflowing, depending on which direction the wind is flowing, into Boston. And so in the black are the observations from my building, is what this is showing. And then in the blue is what our stochastic time inverted Lagrangian model predicted. And that's based on some prior estimates and wind patterns and so forth. So our observations and model agree really well. That's always a good sign. And you can, in this graph, you can see that difference, that about 10 parts per million difference between the air before it gets to the rural kind of inflowing air, and that urban air. Well, that makes sense because I just showed you something analogous. But it's this that has shaped the last decade of my work. What happens to that CO2 enhancement during the summer? During the summer, the delta CO2, the difference in the CO2 between the urban air and the rural air, goes to about 0. And how can that be? Because I started out telling you that 70% of the fossil fuel emissions were happening in cities. So if you have this very concentrated local source in the atmosphere, how during the summer can that gradient entirely disappear? And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And that question has shaped many, many years and many people's work. So if we think about vegetation and how vegetation influences the carbon cycle, my mind, and maybe some of your minds, go to an image like this. This is from the Harvard Forest LTER. This is a sonic anemometer on the longest running eddy covariance tower in the world. This is the Harvard Forest EMS tower. And as far as the eye can see, it's pretty homogeneous vegetation. This is a nice fall image, some mountains in the background. I do not see a broken landscape. Harvard Forest is about as close to a textbook forest as I could think of. It's been studied intensively, perhaps the most intensively studied forest in the world, for many, many decades. More books have been written about this forest than I could count. This forest is not very much like the forests that we have around our cities, like the image that I started out with. These trees look pretty different. There's lawn interspersed, there's buildings, there's roads. These forests, which are just outside downtown Boston in the inner suburbs, also look very different. These forests are adjacent to irrigated, fertilized lawns and roads and buildings. They're in small fractal sort of patches that have variable distances from these adjacent land covers that are imposing an influence. They're also different than these trees and this vegetation. This is, if we zoomed in right in here, these trees are open grown in sunlight. They're growing in an environment that has all that extra CO2 that's being combusted. So they're in a CO2 fertilization experiment that's an uncontrolled one. And they have extra nitrogen coming in the rainfall water there. They're growing in open grown full light conditions, which is very different than what this closed canopy system looks like. Here you have lateral light, you have wide structure trees. This is my yard. You all know that I like kale and tomatoes now. But these sorts of green spaces that are composted, heavily irrigated, and intensively amended are also present all across the urban landscape. And these fluxes from this system are very different than what they are here. There's also the role of removals. Now, if we think about our classic photosynthesis respiration equations, you have CO2 that's taken up by plants during the summertime when their leaves are green, leaves in a deciduous system like what we have in the Northeast United States in the fall time, and then are left in a system like this. They're left in place to decompose over that fall, winter, spring, and into the years that follow. In urban systems, we collect them. We put them to the curb and a vehicle picks them up and takes them away. So we still have photosynthesis occurring, but we've removed locally the material that's going to be decomposing and releasing CO2 back to the atmosphere. So the more and more I thought about what our textbook forest and all of our models have been parameterized upon, and how that relates to the forests that we actually have across much of our landscape, I don't think these are functionally the same. And if we zoom into this challenge, which is a really big one, of fragmentation, you can see that it's a lot of our landscape that we're talking about. So these sort of interspersed heterogeneous patches are present all over the Boston area, Massachusetts, the Northeast U.S., and the globe for that matter. And we did a first analysis a couple of years ago looking at that. So this is a 20-state region across the northeast quarter of the United States that's shown in this top panel. This is the U.S. Forest Service northern domain, and you'll see this domain appear a few times in my talk today. And what we did is we took the National Land Cover Database and we looked at the distribution of land cover. So here, if we go down from this agricultural area, you see lots of agriculture and then forest interspersed. And in this green sort of color, you can see the edge pixels that look a lot like these sort of edge pixels. Some of these edge pixels are next to agriculture, some are next to development. If we go here to southern New Hampshire, you can see that lots of it can be next to development. And so this is just denoting one pixel width, 130 by 30 meter pixel, which is about the length scale of edge effects on forests that I'll talk about more. And if we aggregate this, it turns out there's a lot of these edges. So this might be small to read, but this is, each bar here represents one of those 20 states in this area. And this is the percent of all of the forest in that state. This is organized from smallest state in Delaware here to Michigan and Minnesota over here, which have the most total forest area within this area. And this is showing the percent of all of that state's forest that is within 1 pixel, 30 meters of an edge, kind of like this image. And you can see in the case of Delaware that about 20% of all the state's forest is next to agricultural edges, and about 13% is next to developed edges. In some states, like Iowa, it's very agriculture dominated. In other states like Massachusetts, where I am, it's very dominated by urban development. But on average, across this entire region, about a quarter of all of the forest is within 30 meters of an edge, which means that a quarter of all the forest is next to something like this and might be behaving a little bit differently. So how might it behave differently? If we take a cartoon view of the world and we think about an intact forest and we compare it to what happens at the edge, where you have this sort of transition of agriculture or road or development right at a boundary going into a forest. Right at the edge, there's an increase in turbulence and wind, which can increase the probability of wind throw and trees falling over. Right at the edge, it is hotter and drier, which could induce drought stress, could reduce productivity, could dry the soils out, and could cause mortality. Edges are globally known to be at higher risk for fire. There's a higher probability of ignition near a forest edge. This is particularly true if we're talking about the tropics, but it's true universally. In aggregate, these three mechanisms would be negatives on the forest. They would reduce the growth of the forest. They would reduce the amount of carbon that was stored within those forests. But there's some good sides to being at an edge. At the forest edge, there is more light. Trees compete for light. Trees and vegetation of any sort grow towards the light. They grow taller and try to outcompete their neighbors to access light. In the case of an edge, you have light coming in from the side. So that lateral light can penetrate for 10, 20 meters into the forest and increase the productivity. There's also increased nitrogen inputs near the edge. And that nitrogen can be coming from agriculture and fertilizer applications, which don't always strictly follow the boundary of where the agricultural field versus the forest would be. It could also be coming from roads, which are adjacent to many forests. These two mechanisms of an increase in light and nitrogen would have a stimulatory effect on the system, increasing the amount of biomass present and the growth rate. Now, we wrote this paper in 2018, and in 2018, almost everything that we knew about the impacts of forest fragmentation came from the tropics. It came from studies like the BDFFP study in Amazonia, where they cut 1 hectare squares of forest and looked at what happened at the edges. And what they found in Amazonia unambiguously is that these negative processes dominated. In fact, there have been more papers than I could count across the tropics in particular that say that fragmentation reduces biomass, increases mortality, reduces growth, and has just overall negative impacts on biodiversity and carbon cycling. In temperate systems, there's been much less work done. And so that was one of the directions that we went to try to understand that mismatch between what we were seeing in terms of emissions in the atmosphere and the changes in atmospheric CO2, was to think about, are these forests different because of fragmentation? And so to do this, my student Luca Morielli, who defended last week, I'll show you a couple of his recent papers that he's done on this. So we use the forest inventory, the USDA Forest Inventory and Analysis plots. Now the FIA, the Forest Inventory and Analysis, is a very powerful data set that's collected about every on a 5-year cycle. The USDA lays out this octahexagonal grid across the United States and does a systematic survey of the US forest stocks and changes in the forest stocks. That's used for UN reporting, for understanding the state of our national timber and industry. And we used it in a way it wasn't designed to be used, but we used it to look at this fragmentation question. So there are 48,000 field plots across this 20-state region that we've been focused on that have been manually surveyed by field crews at least twice for our analysis. And we were able to, by digging deep into the supplemental tables of the FIA, identify 6,607 of those 48,000 plots that at least one of the 4 subplots was at an edge, like what I had shown you. And so we were able to use these edge plots versus the forest interior plots to study this question. Now, if you look at these edge and interior plots together, you can see that it's a little bit challenging because it's a non-random distribution of where you have perhaps lots of edges in agricultural areas like this and where you have lots of plots like in northern Maine without as many edges. And so in order to be able to use this data set, we looked at what the distribution of the edge and interior plots looked like, and we used statistical matching so that we could bring the distribution of a number of variables together to have a pseudo experiment that we could create. So we looked at the spatial patterns in atmospheric nitrogen deposition, which follows an east-west gradient with higher deposition in the Midwest, lower deposition, especially by the time you get to the Northeast. So we controlled for the amount of atmospheric nitrogen, which is a limiting nutrient on the system. We controlled for temperature limitations on productivity. Further south, you have less limitation. Further north, you have more limitation. We controlled for light, which is another fundamental limit on productivity. We controlled for water limitations and water availability within these systems. And finally, and most importantly, we controlled for the types of species that were present in the landscape. So we used an EPA forest type map to delineate different vegetation types. So we put all of these together and we controlled in our matching for all of these variables, and then used a generalized linear model to estimate what we saw in terms of the vegetation characteristics at these edge plots versus interior plots. And if we start out by looking at basal area. So basal area is a classic forestry metric that is the cross-sectional area of a patch of land that is covered by trees. So what fraction of the land is covered by this just wood? And this is a proxy for how much biomass is present. And what we found is that the basal area, so the biomass density, if you will, varied by species types, which is not too surprising. So some of the early successional species had less biomass than some of the more later successional species types. Okay. We were then able to parse it and look at the forest edges versus interior, controlling for species and all those other variables that I had mentioned. And what we found is a 14% increase in the amount of biomass that was present in edge forests versus interior forests. So the forests near the edge were storing more wood. If we go one step further and a subset of all these edges, and we looked at just the anthropogenic edges. So these are edges that are next to agriculture or development, but they're not at an ecotone. So they're not at the tree line location or at the edge of a lake or a river. These are some sort of human-dominated system that has created an artificial boundary between forest and non-forest. And if we compare these anthropogenic edges to the interior forests, there's 21% more biomass being stored there. The second piece so what that means is there's more trees there. And what we found is that there are two ways you could get more basal area. You could either have bigger trees, the same number of trees and bigger trees, or you could have more trees of the same size. And what we found is that there are more trees near the edge, not bigger trees. So there are more stems that in aggregate give more basal area. The second piece we could look at is the rate of growth. So how much new wood, how much carbon is being taken up by edge versus interior forests. And so this would be calculated as the basal area increment. So how much new basal area are you getting annually? Similarly, we saw an edge enhancement where the basal area increment, so the annual new wood growth, was 24% higher on all edges than interior, and 36% higher in anthropogenic edges. 36% higher. That's a huge number. That means that 36% more wood is being taken up per unit area that has these edge trees than interior trees. This finding is the opposite of what was found in the tropics. This finding is the opposite of what anecdotal thinking said would happen when you fragmented forests. This is not a decrease in productivity. This is a massive increase in productivity. And critically, we found this increase in productivity without an increase in tree mortality. So the trees weren't dying faster. They were just growing faster, and there was more wood there. Now, to really put these numbers in context, we need to have an idea of not just that we have more trees and they're growing faster, but we also need to think about how much of the landscape is dominated by these different vegetation types. How meaningful is this omission in our thinking and in our modeling about the carbon cycle are these edge forests? And so we did a global analysis for this, and we estimated how much edge forest there was in the temperate region and in the tropical region across the globe. And so what we found is that globally, 17.8% of all temperate forests are less than 30 meters from an edge. That's 217 million hectares of edge forest, which is a lot. And in this graphic is the total area of tropical forest versus temperate forest, and the fraction of the temperate versus the tropical that is within that 1 pixel distance, that 130-meter Landsat pixel from a forest edge, which is a lot of forest. So this was a compelling analysis, but we were left a little uncomfortable with some of the choices that we had to make to do this. This map, methodologically, was, we used Matt Hansen's Global Forest cover product in Google Earth Engine to do the math behind this. But there's choices in that, and we really wanted to dig in how sensitive were our estimates to the kind of the criteria of the land cover that went into it. Now, we could figure out how much edge forest there is using something like the USDA Forest Inventory and Analysis, which is part of what we did in the earlier analysis. But the challenge is that the FIA, they have minimum area thresholds before they consider something a forest. And so when I started out showing you that Harvard Forest was not like a lot of the forests that we had in cities, that's because a lot of the forests that we have in these urban and suburban areas are small patches, which would not meet the minimum area thresholds that the FIA imposes. In fact, the FIA actively excludes from their main inventory any sort of urban areas. So the county, for example, that I am sitting in, Suffolk County, Massachusetts, has 0 FIA plots. And by that account would have 0 forest, which is not true. Remote sensing is another way that we could do this, but remote sensing choices and decisions are made about what land cover classes are delineated, what are the categories, and there's a real challenge of mixed pixels. And an edge is the epitome of a mixed pixel, where it's at the transition between 2 different land cover classes. And so we wanted to see what the sensitivity across kind of these different approaches of trying to figure out edge forests look like. And so we merged 2 data sets, a Massachusetts data set that's shown here, and then a Chesapeake watershed land cover data product. These two data products are at a 1 meter resolution. They're based on extensive aerial surveys and a lot of supplemental data. They are incredible data sets. And conveniently for this analysis, or critically for this analysis, they have very similar legends and years of creation. So using these two data sets, we had 220 counties that span this kind of Northeast region that we looked at. And so I'll walk you through a little bit of the differences that we saw. So this is just a little snippet scene of one of these 1 meter data sets that's overlaid on an aerial image. And so this is a Massachusetts snippet that's shown here. And you can see in green some of the area that's interior forest. And then you could see in blue the edge forest. That's within 30 meters of interior. And if we look at a scene like this one, we could calculate what the total area of forest is, which in this case, with the 1 meter resolution, comes out to 15 square kilometers, and the fraction of all the forest within that area that is edge or interior. We could compare that to another product. This is the U.S. GES National Land Cover Database 30 meter product. This is probably one of the most widely used U.S. land cover products. It estimates much less total forest area. You see a stepwise decline, which makes sense because there's a scale sensitivity. You look at a finer resolution, you can find more. That is not surprising. But there's a shift in the proportion of the forest that is interior versus edge forest. Another more recently, but very popular land cover product is the LC map. This is the Land Change Monitoring Assessment product. This is also from the US GES. Shows similar numbers, but a lower total forest area. And then we could look at something like MODIS. MODIS does not find very much forest in this area. You can see it's only actually 4 MODIS pixels at a resolution of 500 meters. And maybe this is a slightly unfair comparison to include something like MODIS when we're talking about fine scale urban heterogeneity in a landscape like this, but MODIS is still very widely used, and I'm going to show you in a minute that MODIS looks a lot like the forest inventories. So we looked at these different products to see what they would tell us about how much forest, how much edge forest, and what the carbon cycle implications of this would look like. So I'm going to show you 2 slightly complicated figures, so I'll walk through this. On the x-axis is the 1 meter very high resolution land cover product, and I'm going to compare it to the NLCD and LC map. These are at 30 meter, and then MODIS at 500 meter resolution. And this is just showing how much forest would be, how much percent forest cover would be estimated from this 1 meter versus these other products if we look at a county scale. So there were 220 counties in our region. And what we see is that compared to the 1 meter product, the NLCD product shows something that looks very similar if you have lots of forest cover, but diverges at lower forest cover rates. So for areas that have less than 75% forest cover, so for counties that are less than almost completely dominated by forests, it underestimates the total forest area by about 8%, right? So you see it going off of the 1-to-1 line here in black. You see something similar with the LC map, but the number increases to 14%. And then when we get to MODIS, the number increases to 26%. So MODIS is missing just overall across this whole area about 26% of the forest. And it's particularly true as the extent becomes smaller. If we switch here to the amount of forest cover in the 1 meter on the X to what fraction of that is edge forest here on the Y, you can see that at a 1 meter resolution, if you have lots of forest, like 80, this is 90% forest, you're going to have very little edge because 90% of the area is forest, so you're going to have lots of interior. As the absolute forest cover decreases, the edge proportion increases. If we compare, and so on average, 42% of the forest area is edge forest based on this 1 meter resolution. If we switch to the NLCD, you see the same broad pattern, but the slope of the relationship change, where it's estimating not just much less forest, which we saw in the last slide, but much less edge forest. It's estimating that it's underestimating the amount of edge by 24%. LC map is similar. MODIS is only estimating 7% of all the forests as being edge forests. And the forest inventory and analysis, which is the gold standard that goes into every verification of carbon models out there, behaves like MODIS functionally, where it is dramatically underestimating not just the amount of forest area, but the amount of edge forest area. And this was a question that was nagging at us as we were thinking about that first analysis that I showed you from Luca's first dissertation chapter, where we found these really large differences between edge and interior. And we had this nagging fear of, were we double counting? Was it already embedded in the FIA? And the answer is no. The FIA has a systematic underestimate of not just forest area, but the amount of edge forest area as well. So what we're working on now is the final step of this analysis, which is the so what. If we look across this 20-state region and you put all of these pieces together, the differences in the uptake rates, the differences in the amount of basal area, the differences in the amount of uptake rate, the amount of forest, the amount of edge forest, and we're finalizing that analysis now. And the answer is that the forests in the northeastern 20 states of the US are likely, we're underestimating the carbon sink by about 20%, maybe 15 to 20%. And that's a big deal for our global carbon budgets and our thinking about forests, our thinking about what forests do for climate. Now, I've been talking about edge forests so far, and I want to zoom back into cities. If we think about cities, this is Boston. This is a classified land cover map that's shown here. The city is all edge forest. It is the distance of the canopy from 0 to 10 meters, looking at different types of land cover in the forest. It's all edge forest. And so what that means is that difference that I had started out with of how does that difference in the atmospheric CO2 disappear? Well, part of the answer is that it's all edge forests and it is behaving differently. We looked at this in Boston, looking at street trees, and we compared it to Harvard Forest. We controlled for the size of the tree, and we controlled for species. And what we saw is, on average, tree for tree, the same size, same species, the urban tree grew 4 times faster. 4 times faster. So if you have a choice of, do we conserve a patch of urban forest or a patch of rural forest? Or do we plant a tree in the city or do we plant a tree outside the city? These numbers have big implications for that, because if those urban fragmented trees are performing from a carbon storage and a carbon uptake perspective 4 times the rate as the rural trees, that's an important finding. I will briefly mention that there is this other piece of the carbon cycle. It's not all just photosynthesis and carbon storage. There's also carbon loss through respiration. Now, most models will assume that higher temperatures near the forest edge would drive higher respiration rates and carbon loss. And that's what we see in rural systems. In urban systems, this is work by my student Sarah Garvey, we see a suppression of respiration. The respiration rates are actually lower. The temperatures are higher, the soil moisture is lower, but the rate of carbon loss is lower. And what that means is not only are these urban areas, these fragmented areas, storing more carbon than we expected, taking up more carbon than we expected, they're also losing less carbon than we expected in the form of respiration. And that could be in part because of those Home Depot or Costco bags of yard waste that we put on the curb. So if we come back to this figure that I had started at of how can it be that 70% of the fossil fuel emissions are concentrated in cities, but during the summer, the entire CO2 gradient between rural and urban goes to zero? Well, after 10 years of working on this problem, I think the answer is that they fundamentally cycle carbon and water differently. The conditions in these fragments and temperate fragments in cities are different. It's hotter, drier, and the entire landscape is much more fragmented, meaning it has more access to things like that extra light and that extra nitrogen. The trees grow faster and they respire less. At least that's what we see in the Northeast U.S. We've been largely looking across a 20-state region, but this relationship might break down if we looked in the South, where there's more sandy soils. If we looked in the West, where pests and fire play a different role. But at least for this domain, which is not a small one, this is what we've been finding pretty universally, which is surprising. Now, I had hoped to tell you a short vignette about water, which is the other piece of this system, because plants are trading water for carbon. That's how this is possible, but I think I've run out of time. So maybe I'll stop here. And if anyone is dying to see what we've been doing on urban heat islands, I could stay and show you for 5 minutes some of the tools we've been developing for that. So I'll stop there and take some questions.
Thanks so much. This was utterly fascinating. And there's just so many, I mean, there's a lot of people concerned with policy about urban, planting more and more trees in urban forests. I think there's a lot of people going to be interested in this. So we have one question from Matt Fagan, so I'm going to let him take the first question. Let's see if there are a couple of questions, and then we'll see if we have a couple of minutes at the end. We could go back and look at that for those who are interested. So Matt, take it away. Ask your question.
Oh, okay. I have two questions. One, thank you, Lucy. That was awesome. I'm trying to make the clappy hand thing, and I stuck my hand up. So that's just fun. So I was wondering, when you did your high resolution fragmentation analysis, did you try to exclude individual trees? Because you see that a lot that in the Chesapeake data, Bay data. And then I have a second follow-up question on a related topic.
We had more what my student Luca Morielli called dorm room philosophical conversations about what is a forest and is a tree a forest and how many trees do you need to make a forest. We went deep down those rabbit holes. And I don't think that there is a clear and hard singular line of what percent canopy cover you need or what area you need to have it covered. In these products, we required not 1 meter of trees, but a 5 by 5. It was kind of what we had required in this, but it is sensitive to that assumption.
I'd be curious to see how sensitive, because you could get like average canopy size of a street tree and kind of go from there and be like, then what do you say? You need 4 street trees together to be a forest? Like, but I'd be interesting to say, like, if you
There's
kind of,
configuration too, right? If you have 4 street trees in a row, does that make a forest versus if you have 2 by 2 trees? And I think it's maybe forest is the wrong way to be thinking about it. If you think about just the carbon that is stored in the wood and in the tissue, that it's meaningful and it accumulates.
and I had a follow-up question because I was thinking about street trees, and we know quite a bit about street tree mortality, right? There's studies out there. I was just found one Googling around, but I was like, I found the same one I found before, which is this nice Forest Service one. And I'm wondering, have people done careful comparisons of mortality between street trees and forest trees of the same species, and kind of one to one? Because we just run numbers, it looks like street trees die more often.
They
Um,
do, they definitely do. And if I could get this to go backwards. We did that in this paper, and I did not put that slide in here. So in the Smith et al.
I'll
2020
go reread
paper,
it.
we did exactly that. I focused on the growth piece because that's where most of this narrative arc was, but we looked at mortality. And you're absolutely right. The mortality is enhanced, but it's enhanced in an interesting way. There's a U-shape enhancement in the mortality. So the small diameter trees die at a much higher rate. If they survive that initial shock of establishment, they will survive. And then they die at the large diameters at a higher rate because they pose a hazard and they're preemptively removed before they catastrophically fall.
Interesting. Fascinating. Okay, that's the one paper you were talking about. I was like, I did not read that entire paper. I want to go reread that one. So that's awesome that's there. Thank you. I think I'll yield time.
Thanks for that question, Matt. And Stu Schwartz has a question. So Stu, feel free to unmute and ask your question. Oh, okay, and Anisha too, because I was not looking at the hands raised. So Stu, are you able to unmute and ask?
I don't think
All right,
so.
I'll read it. I'll read it for you. He says, I infer small diameter trees grow more slowly in the hardwood forest due to shading and competition from existing mature trees. It seems that small trees in a forest are small because they're growing slowly, but would you plant trees in such a footprint? I.e., if you clear cut plots in the hardwood forest, would you still expect the small trees to grow slowly?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. I think I'd expect them to grow faster, but I think that some of the differences in the mortality would play out differently, right? Because you would have higher density of those small trees, so they would be, following kind of classic forest dynamics and succession. They would be growing like mad to establish themselves within the developing canopy, but there would be massive mortality. And I don't have those numbers because we just cut down. I'm very popular. We just cut down with Andy Reinman a giant new experiment at Harvard Forest at the LTER to create an edge. So I got to support the first wide-scale harvesting at Harvard Forest in a long time to be able to answer some of those questions. But I don't know. It's a good question.
Okay, thanks. Anisha, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Hutyra, for that fascinating talk. I have a question which I think you may have answered, but I'll ask it anyway. So I was wondering whether you would expect tree growth to sort of saturate at some point, or does that saturation get delayed because the adult trees are dying off?
I don't know. There's a rich literature on that about if we get out of the fragmented urban rural question of just when should old growth forests stop taking up carbon? And the answer to just that first one of like, when should it plateau or saturate? There's the classic textbooks that say what should happen, and that's not what a lot of the observations are seeing. And there's lots of different reasons for that, maybe. CO2 fertilization, changes in nitrogen deposition, or whether it be increases or decreases, changes in the disturbance dynamics and gap fractions. So in a natural system, I think it's more complicated than our standard forest ecology textbooks would suggest. In an urban system, I think it's even further complicated, but the human removals really complicate it because they just become much more hazardous to leave in place in a developed system. So they're preemptively removed.
That's interesting. Thanks.
Okay, so I actually have a question, but here's what I'm going to propose. If you want to take a few minutes just to talk a little bit about the other topic, and then maybe if there are even a few people who could stick around to the end, I'd like to ask my question so I could get your answer on a recording before we close. But if you wanted to actually cover a little bit about what you're talking about for those who are still here.
Okay, so the other piece that I wanted to talk about was water. So the trees are trading carbon for water. They're taking up more carbon dioxide, which we've just walked through. And so they must be using more water to do that. So this is a graph that shows mean daytime temperature. This is for sugar maple trees in an urban setting and a rural setting. And this is the mean sap flux. This is water moving through the stem of the tree. Now, the amount of water that's lost through a leaf, stomata, is determined by a number of factors, but daytime temperature, the vapor pressure deficit, and sunlight are three key factors that control that. Now, this is a rural sugar maple tree that has a weak relationship with these climate drivers. There's a slight positive slope of it gets warmer, it gets sunnier, the rate of this increases. The mean daytime temperature in this rural location, 23 degrees. Urban, strong relationship with these climatic drivers, no sign of a saturation or a decline, even though we're at almost 30 degrees temperature. So urban trees don't seem to show the same water and temperature limitations as their rural counterparts, or even the controls. And that's because, I believe, urban trees have lots of water. They have water available to them from rainfall that's coming into both rural and urban systems. They have groundwater that they might be able to tap in both cases. But in the urban case, they also have irrigation. They have stormwater runoff that's being funneled to the impervious patches where the plants can access it. And they also are able to access water from leaking water pipes and sewage pipes, which are making both water and nutrients available below ground. And so we've been thinking a lot about this water carbon nexus trade-off space. And I actually, at this point, think that the biggest benefit that urban trees have in terms of nature-based solutions and ecosystem services in urban areas is mitigation of heat island. So this is a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago that is really exciting and is something that we're going to continue working on for the next couple of years. We looked across 7 U.S. cities here, and we looked at what the direct temperature impact in degrees Kelvin would be if you increase 1% tree cover, had a 1% cover change in grass, buildings, pavement, or albedo. And so what you see is that for the trees, there's actually a really large spread here between what the addition of a tree would mean in Boston versus in Durham versus in San Jose. And grass, which is what a lot of the green stuff in cities actually is, was equally variable, but had a much smaller effect than trees. And in the case of San Jose, this data set was actually split where we saw irrigated grass versus non-irrigated grass. And non-irrigated grass actually made the city hotter versus irrigated grass making it cooler. Albedo also influenced how much of the heat was absorbed. We did this analysis at the census block. We looked at spatial contagion in this. So this is the direct effects. This is the indirect effects of the spatial Durbin model that we had run here. We also looked at what are some of the drivers of the cross-city variability. And what we found was latitude, or global horizontal irradiance, and the land surface water index, so how much water was available, had a near, explained 97% of the variance in what the cooling efficiency of these trees looked like. So a tree in Boston is not equal to a tree in Durham, New Hampshire. But we actually could predict quite well what the cooling benefits would be. In the case of grass, it wasn't light that mattered, it was just moisture. So we've taken these marginal effects, these sensitivities for a unit change in grass, tree, and albedo, and we've been working with the Planning and Redevelopment Agency in Boston this was at their urging, to create a tool that could look at what would happen if this land parcel was redeveloped into this, which is an actual proposal before the Planning and Redevelopment Agency. And so we developed a tool that operated at the census block where we could look at what the tree cover of the current site was, what the land surface temperature looked like, the grass cover, the roads, and we created a toggling tool where they could see what the local climate, the local temperature impacts would be of a redevelopment solution. And so if we just took into account the changes in land cover, that's what you see there. And now the little movie will show you what happens if you change the albedo, which this building, because of the white roofs and the surface choices, actually comes out to be about the same temperature, even though it's a completely different configuration in what the land looks like. So this is one of the next directions, which is kind of looking at that carbon water interface and looking at climate impacts and solutions. That was the last vignette.
Okay, so we're a little past 1 o'clock, but if I can just, we've got some people who are still here, so I'm just gonna ask my question, and then if anybody has any last minute questions, we can go ahead and entertain those. So first of all, I just want to say that it's very rare to hear a talk that both challenges a lot of the sort of what has become the conventional wisdom on an important issue, and is also almost all good news. That's just both those things at the same time. I mean, so that leads me to my question, which is that there's a lot of urban communities that are in the process of planning for planting a lot of trees. And there's been some skepticism because of some of the things we heard, for example, about mortality of street trees and so forth, finding places to build them and everything. So I'm curious, because it strikes me you're already working with local authorities at the application end of this. You know, I happen to serve on the Commission on Environmental Quality for Baltimore County, where I live, and we have had a lot of conversations about the county's intended policies on planting. So are you getting a lot of interest, or is it just not as broadly known? I'm just curious. This seems to me to be something that has implications that will be of interest to a lot of people in these urban settings. What are you hearing from people, or what are you saying to them about how this should affect their thinking about what they're going to do, other than the specific planning like what you show on this slide?
So this has gotten a lot of attention, actually, locally and then beyond. I've been talking to Google a lot about some of this and scalability of these sorts of analyses and tools. But in Boston, I've actually had more conversations than I could count about this, because trees are wonderful. And if you indulge me for a second, I will show you an image out of a white paper that we recently wrote. I just need to pull it up. Trees are wonderful and completely not viable for everywhere, because you have to actually have space for trees, and that may or may not be true. This is my student Ian Smith, who defended last week. I'm going to show you what he did that answers your question directly. So this was a white paper that we published a few months ago, where we looked at different neighborhoods in Boston and what their demand for cooling was. How did we define demand for cooling? We looked at the hazard of how hot was it in the first place and who was living there in terms of age, poverty, language, vulnerability in their living system, and racial composition. So the need for cooling was uneven across the city because the temperatures were uneven and the social vulnerability was different. So we looked at that. And then we looked at in the places that had the highest need for cooling versus lowest need. So these are just in 10 decile bins. We looked at how much land there was that was currently occupied by trees in those census blocks. So the highest demand places had on average fewer trees. That's not that fine. That's surprising. They also had less space available to possibly plant trees. So this is the areas that you wouldn't have to be ripping up pavement, that they had some sort of permeable surface that trees could be planted. So there's less potential to plant trees. They were also systematically different. So in these highest areas, you had more building, which is kind of the inverse of the trees. But half of all of those buildings in the highest vulnerability neighborhoods were systematically different, kind of like Baltimore, I'm going to guess. They were triple deckers with flat black rubber roofs, where it wasn't this sort of setting, it was a flat roof that with a couple $100s for a white coating could dramatically change the temperature. And so what we ran here was this was one of the more vulnerable census blocks. There was one vacant lot here, but there's almost nowhere to plant trees. But the buildings are all these flat black rubber roofs. The temperature cooling impact that we could get from trees, this is a best case scenario. If you could magically plant and have survived full-size trees, you could get about a ½ degree cooling in this area, versus you could get a 2-degree cooling if you painted the roofs. And so we've been doing this sort of analysis, and a lot of this has been iterative with the city, of them asking questions, us trying to answer them, and then the 17 more questions that come up along the way. But I have a strong passion for trying to do solution-oriented science. And this is an example of that.
That is equally fascinating. I've had colleagues who have looked at the issue of white roofs versus green roofs and find that in many cases you do about as well with painting as in trying to maintain the vegetation cover on a green roof. But this is really interesting to have this trade-off illustrated because, yeah, I mean, Baltimore has a lot of abandoned houses. I don't know there's potential for actually planting trees in some of those lots, but it would be a lot of work. And I just think that there's going to, I suspect, a lot of interest in this area also for the kinds of things that you're showing here. So in conclusion, because we actually are now about 10 minutes beyond 1 o'clock, it's been worth every second. Thanks so much for a really fascinating seminar. I will let you know once we have the recording back so that if you want to share it, it'll be posted on our the Center for Social Science Scholarships YouTube channel, probably within a few days. And thanks so much. I'm sure that there may well be people who want to contact you to ask further about this. A lot of interest in urban forests in this area here too. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. I'm going to just stop the recording.